Welcome to my channel. Rome was arguably the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. But how did it go from being a powerful republic to a vast empire spanning 3 continents? And how did that empire eventually collapse into a pile of rubble? Let's find out in today's episode. Ancient Rome didn't start out as an empire. It started out as a small village of less than 1,000 people on the Italian peninsula. Legend has it that the city was founded by Romulus, who killed his twin brother Remus after the 2 of them were raised by a she-wolf. Though we don't know if this is true or not. What we do know is that around the 6th century BC, Rome grew into a monarchy. Around 509 BC, the Romans overthrew their Etruscan king and replaced him with a new system of government, a republic. Rome then spent the next couple centuries expanding its territory and fighting wars against neighboring Italian states. By the late 3rd century BC, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean after defeating Carthage in a long and bloody war. But with this newfound power came challenges. As Rome grew in size, it became more and more difficult to govern over such vast distances, and the social and economic gap between the rich and poor grew wider and wider. The result was a series of civil wars and insurrections that nearly tore the Republic apart. But ultimately, a brilliant general named Julius Caesar emerged victorious. Though Caesar was assassinated soon after, his adopted son Augustus would go on to defeat his rivals and proclaim himself the first emperor of Rome in 31 BC. This marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus gave himself the title of princeps, meaning first citizen, rather than king or emperor. He wanted to maintain the facade that Rome was still a republic. But there was no mistaking the fact that all power was concentrated in his hands. The Senate, once the center of Roman political life, was reduced to a supporting role, and its influence over the vast empire was greatly diminished. Augustus also reformed the army, reorganized local governments, established a professional civil service, and set up a system of roads, aqueducts, and public works throughout the empire. But perhaps his greatest achievement was in the realm of propaganda. Augustus commissioned poets, historians, and artists to create a positive image of himself and the new imperial dynasty. The result was a carefully crafted mythology that portrayed the Julio-Claudians as the rightful heirs to the Roman tradition and the bringers of peace and prosperity. After Augustus, the Julio-Claudians held power for over 50 years, though none of them were particularly notable except for Augustus and Nero. Tiberius was often too ill to govern, so he delegated much of the day-to-day administration to a trusted general named Sejanus. When Sejanus betrayed him, however, Tiberius went insane with grief and paranoia. Caligula was even worse, notorious for his sexual excesses and sadistic behavior. Claudius was often mocked by his own family and considered weak and ineffectual. Yet he oversaw the conquest of Britain. Nero was perhaps the most infamous of the Julio-Claudians, known for his extravagant spending, artistic ambitions, and cruelty towards his own family. His mother, Agrippina, and his wife Poppaea Sabina both died under mysterious circumstances that many believe were orchestrated by Nero. The Julio-Claudians finally ended with Nero's death in 68 AD. There was no clear heir, so the Praetorian Guard, a special military force responsible for guarding Rome, declared their support for whichever candidate was willing to pay them the most. That candidate was none other than Galba, the governor of Spain. Rome then descended into a brutal civil war in which four emperors lost their lives within 18 months. The first was Nero's chosen successor, his former stepbrother, Marcus, who was murdered by his own grandmother, Julia Maesa. But it was actually Maesa's other daughter, Faustina, who emerged as the real winner of the civil war. She secured the support of the Praetorian Guard and made her son, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the new emperor. Known as Vespasian, he founded the Flavian dynasty, which would last for over 2 centuries. Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian were notable for their public works projects, their patronages of the arts, and their suppression of the Jewish revolt in Judea. But it was under Domitian that the seeds of the empire's decline were sown. He was a cruel and erratic tyrant who alienated many of the elite and squandered the empire's wealth on grandiose projects. His assassination in 96 AD led to a brief period of anarchy, after which Nerva took the throne. Nerva's adopted successor was Trajan, a former military commander who had distinguished himself in the conquest of Dacia. He was a popular emperor who continued the building projects of his predecessors and launched a series of military campaigns that pushed the empire to its territorial peak. Unfortunately, Trajan was childless, and when he died in 117 AD, the empire once again teetered on the brink of civil war. But Trajan's adopted heir, Hadrian, was able to restore stability and consolidate the gains of his predecessors. Hadrian was a cosmopolitan ruler who preferred the company of intellectuals and homosexual partners to generals and gladiators. He revised Roman law, standardized weights and measures, and sponsored major building projects like the Pantheon. But Hadrian was childless as well, and when he died in 138 AD, the empire was once again in danger of falling into civil war. Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, was a dull and uncharismatic ruler who was more interested in farming than in ruling an empire. But he appointed a capable administrator named Gaius Julius Caesar to manage the provinces. When Antoninus died in 161 AD, Antoninus was unable to secure the support of the Praetorian Guard, and Cassius sided with the more popular Lucius Verus, who became the new emperor. Together they proved to be an effective team. They launched a successful campaign against the Parthians, and Marcus Aurelius wrote a philosophical treatise called Meditations. Sadly, Commodus ended the Antonini dynasty and plunged the empire into chaos. He was a spoiled and tyrannical ruler who alienated the Senate and wasted the empire's resources on gladiatorial games and chariot races. Fortunately, his advisors were able to keep him in check, and Rome avoided civil war. A series of capable emperors followed, including Pertinax, Julian the Apostate, and the two Gordians. But it was under Septimius Severus in 197 AD that the Severan dynasty began. Severus was a capable administrator who reformed the tax system and suppressed revolts in Judea and Africa. He was succeeded by his wife Julia Maesa and their two sons, Caracalla, who was assassinated in 17 AD, and Macrinus, who was forced to abdicate in favor of Elagabalus in 22 AD. Elagabalus was notoriously cruel and eccentric, but he was succeeded by his grandfather's favorite, Alexander Severus, in 29 AD. By this point, cracks had begun to show in the foundation of the empire. Rome was beset by crises on all sides. The economy was in sharp decline. The population had plummeted due to disease and warfare, and the frontiers of the empire were increasingly under pressure from outside invaders. The Goths, a Germanic tribe, had crossed the Danube and were raiding into the Balkans. The Persians had seized control of the Levant and were threatening Rome directly. The result was a series of costly and inconclusive wars that drained the imperial treasury and the manpower reserves. The endless conflicts also distracted Rome from the growing threat in the east, posed by the Sasanians. Under Shapur I, the Sasanians defeated several Roman emperors and seized control of Mesopotamia. To make matters worse, the 3rd century was a time of profound social and cultural upheaval across the empire. Traditional Roman values and institutions were in sharp decline, and the influx of foreign peoples and ideas from the East was unsettling to many Romans. In response, some turned to traditional religion, while others embraced a new mystery cult that promised salvation and renewal. Among these cults was Christianity, which offered a message of hope and salvation to the downtrodden and persecuted. While Christianity itself did not cause the fall of Rome, it did emerge as a significant factor during this period. In 284 AD, a soldier named Diocletian seized power in a military revolt. He then embarked on a sweeping reorganization of the empire, splitting it into eastern and western halves, reforming the army, establishing a professional civil service, and introducing a new currency. He also undertook a brutal persecution of Christians, hoping to crush the growing movement once and for all. However, these persecutions only succeeded in driving the Christians underground and making the faith more popular. After 20 years of rule, Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, revealing the Tetrarchy's dependence on a strong central figure. The following years were marked by conflict until Constantine emerged as the sole emperor of the Western Empire in 312 AD. Constantine, who had previously granted religious toleration to Christians, now legalized Christianity throughout the empire. He then transferred the empire's center of power eastward, rebuilding the ancient city of Byzantium and renaming it Constantinople on November 8, 324. The new capital became a symbol of a transformed empire. In 330 AD, he officially made it the New Rome. After Constantine, the empire was once more divided by his successor, Theodosius, who split the realm between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. The Western Roman Empire was already in sharp decline by this point, but it still put up a good fight against the barbarians. For another century, in 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked Rome, but the city quickly recovered. However, in 455, Rome was sacked by the Vandals, after which it never really recovered. On September 4th, 476, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, and established his own kingdom in Italy. Though some historians argue that the empire continued on in some form, or that the Eastern Roman Empire was the true heir of the West. There is no denying that the fall of Rome marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new world order. So ends yet another chapter of our history. And thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like down below and subscribe if you want to see more.